Welcome to Olympian Method, the show where we ask the big questions in philosophy. Please leave any answers that you feel like you might want to share in the comments down below. Don't forget to hit that bell, subscribe, like the video. We would greatly appreciate it. We want to give a brief shout out to Subhash Kaushal for asking. He commented on one of our postmodernism episodes, the very first one, and he said reading is getting replaced by listening. And it strikes me because podcasting has become such an effective means of communication, has it not, Wolf?
Oh, for sure. It's opened up. I mean, I remember, you think of the ways of sharing information across long distances. For a long time, books were kind of the only way that you could do that, right? And it's only been a fairly recent phenomenon, thanks to technology, the internet mostly, that you can have other mediums of sharing information across long distances, things like podcasts and videos and those sorts of things.
Well, it's really bringing the oral tradition, A-U-R-A-L, not O-R-A-L, but the oral tradition of speaking, which was how many cultures kept their histories alive. It wasn't even through, it was before writing.
Right. There weren't written histories for, I don't want to quote historians because I don't know like the period of time, but there was a long period of time when written history wasn't a thing.
Like Homer, the Odyssey by Homer, I believe was actually memorized start to finish. And that's a hefty book to memorize. But anyway, that was a really, we really appreciate the comment. We really appreciate the feedback. If you do comment, we will give you a shout out. And we obviously can't do it for everybody if we get like hundreds of thousands of comments, but because we're so early in our development right now, we greatly want to have a dialogue with anyone that's willing to participate.
Yeah, get in on the ground floor while it's good.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of ground floor, it makes me think of base needs. As we've been doing this podcast, you and I have been kind of on our own respective journeys, and I don't want to get too personal, but it's interesting how you had mentioned something before we started recording about how when you're in the cycle of fight and flight, or if you're in the sort of the mode of the grind, it can be kind of hard to philosophize sometimes. Philosophy kind of ranks somewhere near the top of our pyramid of needs, does it not?
Right. I don't remember all the steps in the hierarchy, but I know that the base survival ones are kind of at the bottom, and somewhere near the top is like self-actualization, the types of things that you get through philosophy, in my opinion. And it's pretty easy when you're like you were saying, you're like blinders on, you're just sort of heads down, focused on the survival aspects of life, to not be able to, or not want to, take a break and sort of take a step back from your own thoughts, start to analyze them, those sorts of things. It's pretty easy to sort of fall into the mode of just wanting to escape, right, from reality in large cases when reality is not so pleasant.
Right. And we're still in the pandemic. Nothing's changed. We're still here, folks. But it's interesting how, with a lot of the COVID relief packages that came out, in my case, it was like, wow, that was more money than I've ever made in my entire life. And that I used to work like 40 hours a week in like a biotech lab sometimes, or 16, sometimes up to 16-hour days in a restaurant. And it was like, I was making more money not doing anything, and to have all those basic needs provided, it was kind of a eerie sensation. I don't know how to describe it.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the utopian experiment that we talked about before, right? It's like once all those needs are met, like what do you start doing in order to sort of gain like fulfillment in life, right?
Right. What are your goals?
Right. Because a lot of people, their goals, especially the ones who are sort of so focused on survival aspects, are, just about making ends meet. And that basically is like, so, what jobs do you need to get? How do you advance in your career? Like usually that's what most people focus on for a large part of their life until they reach some stage where they feel they can retire from working, right?
Right. Which is so interesting. So to compound on that, already being given that kind of money, I'm not retired by any stretch of the imagination, but I came into some money recently, and it's like I'm almost on a sabbatical. We'll just say that. Like everything's kind of on pause, but it was so interesting when I was basically, I don't want to say being given the Garden of Eden because that's a very gross oversimplification, but when I was basically giving a really big buffer from financial ruin. Yeah. It really kind of messed with my head a little bit. It messed with my head and my reward system. I'm like, okay, I wake up.
What was going through your head at that time?
Well, before that, I was really thinking like this, like I really wanted to get the ball rolling on this podcast. I really wanted to get the ball rolling on getting music back into music, as a way of like getting some income, Wolf's smarter than me. He's a computer engineer. I'm just a service industry guy,
but we're both into music, and that's what unites us.
That is what unites us. Hey, I think we've mentioned music almost every podcast at least once.
It's kind of important to us.
It really is. But anyway, the impetus for striving to grow was very much like present. There was a little bit of a fire under my ass when I wasn't so sure about my financial future. It made me look for ways of like, okay, maybe I can do this, maybe I can do that.
Well, it's also like in large. I'll probably butcher the quote, but there's something about a restriction that spurs innovation and creativity, right? And I think it's necessity is the mother of all invention is the phrase I was reaching for. And so when you're in that mode where you put and I've also noticed this is true of me, like for a lot of artistic and musical projects, is the ones where I've been under the tightest deadlines and constraints are the ones that usually turn out the best, because you're taking away that artificial excuse for not delivering something. Because the projects that have for me gone the worst are usually the ones that are so open-ended and I don't have a deadline I'm trying to meet. There's no one on the other end of that who's keeping me accountable for it, right?
Yeah, I've been in that position too. I might have even been in that position with this podcast. I being self-denigrating on my part, but the limitations on music. I mean, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but
it's not just music. I mean, I think all art forms have that essential quality of, by putting certain restrictions on the sort of the parameters of what you're creating, by not leaving you with such an open-ended possibility, it actually gives you better outcomes in the end.
That's very true. Well, it gives you kind of a goal. It gives you, at least, if you have a deadline at the very least, it gives you a goal. I know that actually a lot of writers, they will actually force themselves to have deadlines, to have books written, even if they don't have a deadline set by their publisher.
Yeah, I've also heard from writers that a lot of them will have a process where they force themselves to write a certain number of pages per day, which is another like restriction or limitation or like forcing factor or whatever they're putting on themselves. And sometimes that it takes that level in order to get you to make forward progress, even when you feel like the work you're putting in is not getting you progress. It still is. It's just you're not thinking it is.
Right. You almost kind of have, I think it's almost like what you're talking about is like a self-will or discipline, really.
Right. Very much so.
So, yeah. Well, Joe Rogan talks about a similar thing. He would force himself to write like 1,000 words of just nonsense. He calls it nonsense, but like, stand-up comedy, like some of it would be good, some of it would be bad, but he just forced himself to write with no judgment. And so I think whatever it is that you're doing, this is what I've been reflecting on for the past couple of days. And it's going to be the segue into this book right here, Marcus Aurelius Meditations. But when you have an attitude of acceptance, but not only acceptance of gratitude for what you're going through, it does it gives you a little bit of a shift in how you go about what it is that you're doing.
Can you describe what the shift is?
So, for example, I've alluded jokingly to the fact that I'm grateful maybe I haven't, but I'm grateful to be able to breathe, right?
Right.
So there's a technique in psychology, it's called grounding, where you pay attention to, mindful of your body, like your toes, like your ankles, your knees. You go throughout your body and you ground yourself in your surroundings. But outside of that, it's also just kind of having the gratitude for the fact that your feet hold you up all day. Your knees are able to hold you up. I mean, it's a miracle, right?
Right.
The fact that, I'm able to do this podcast with you. I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for you. There's so many
I'm grateful for the music that we've made together. All these things that there's, none of it had to happen, right?
Right. But when you choose to apply gratitude within your intention, it actually makes it impossible for your mind to produce negative thoughts. And they can actually back that up with science.
That is interesting. I was going to ask a follow-up question. What do you think are the effects of not having gratitude? Like, what are the downsides? What are the results of that?
I think in choosing to have gratitude, if you have gratitude, it's almost like you're looking at everything as being a gift. To some extent.
So if you don't have gratitude, would you say that generally means that you are neutral about things, or is it more the case that you are actually negative, like pessimist about things if you're not having gratitude?
I think it leaves you vulnerable to being pessimistic. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that. You can be neutral. I think you can have gratitude or not have gratitude, but I think having gratitude is a good hedge against pessimism.
Is that the only like downside of not having gratitude? I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are.
Well, you also don't want to have toxic gratitude, right? Like, for example, gratitude could be considered a virtue in the Stoic philosophy, as is compassion. But if you have too much compassion, it can actually be hurtful. So like if you shelter children too much when they're growing up, if you don't let them skateboard, for example, if you don't let them explore the bounds of what it is that their body can do, if you don't let them sort of strive and maybe risk danger, then they never grow. Yeah,
I mean, you could say, I think this goes back to one of the things we talked about in the previous episodes, that in some ways we're on the, like, we're headed in a direction where I'm wondering if we're making life too safe in some ways, because we're trying to remove every possible stress and all of the sources of pain in life, right? And we talked about there's potential downsides to that as well.
Well, what's really interesting about that is it's actually creating more stress, depending on who you talk to.
In certain cases, yeah, it definitely is.
I mean, but this kind of goes, it's a perfect segue into Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And having the Stoic mindset of whatever stress might be befalling you, to kind of accept it and almost be grateful for it, and to not react to it, is kind of the, I don't want to say it's the framework or the baseline for being a good leader, but for those of you who don't know who Marcus Aurelius is, he was considered one of the greatest Roman emperors to have ever lived. And a little backstory about the book: he actually did not intend for this to be published. He wrote these as basically just private journal entries, and they were all towards him. It was all about keeping himself accountable.
Yeah,
which is so interesting. Most of the time when people write in today's world, they're trying to get some sort of like external goal completed.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting sort of perspective into someone's mind that you don't usually get through writing.
Exactly. And it just makes me wonder, it's like, what would happen if like people followed that sort of formula and just kind of thought about what they were grateful for? So I want to go to the first chapter, and I just want to read you a little bit of the things that Marcus is grateful for.
Okay.
But this is the first entry in his book. So he first starts out with his grandfather, Varus, for teaching him decency and a mild temper. And we can do a whole episode on what is decency. But
oh yeah,
like I said, you can tear apart each of these as far as you want. But from my mother, piety, generosity, the avoidance of wrongdoing, and even the thought of it. Also simplicity of living, well clear of the habits of the rich. Interesting. Maybe he's kind of alluding to the fact that his mother taught him, don't have too few problems, because then that's a problem in and of itself.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah. So the book is, he's grateful for his family. He's grateful for his tutors. He's grateful for people who teach him, for example, never just say to anyone that I am too busy. Like, always to say yes to people. Like, if you actually have the time, make time for people, regardless of who it is. And
yeah, because the interesting thing about that is that it seems like that is a way of sort of expressing gratitude, but it's also like, the thing that's like interesting to me about that is that you also have to be able to establish boundaries, though, right?
Right.
So I don't know what he would have to say about that topic.
I don't know. I mean, obviously he's a Roman emperor. He can't give his time to like all of the.
Well, were all of these written when he was an emperor, or were any of them written before that time?
Actually, these were mostly all written when he was emperor. Yeah.
Okay.
But they allude to a lot of the teachings. So Marcus Aurelius Meditations, I highly recommend you read it. The introduction, the commentary on it is just phenomenal. It gives the history of the Roman Empire before its collapse. And it talks a lot about virtue. There are four main virtues that are discussed in the book. One of them is sophrosune, the Greek term for sophrosune.
I'm impressed you know this Greek.
I came across it in the book and I wanted to memorize it. So sophrosune is self-control, basically.
Is this going to become our new eudaimonia?
We're going to learn a whole bunch of Greek words here, folks. I mean, we are called Olympian Method. Come on, we got to live. We got to live up to it, right?
So, can you give me an example of how you might see this? I've already forgotten the word. Sophrosune.
Sophrosune, yeah.
Sophrosune.
And I don't know exactly what sune means, but soph means like sophistry is like knowing. So
yeah.
I think it's like maybe knowing the limits of, I don't know what sune means actually, so I can't comment on that, but having self-control. So maybe staying your anger, or maybe like lustful temptations, maybe like impulsive decisions. And
so it's like a form of discipline?
A form of discipline, yeah. I think it's probably attributes itself to a form of mindfulness, actually.
Okay.
Mindfulness of what it is, what your unconscious desires are. And using your conscious mind is like a hedge against that.
Okay.
I spent so much time. There's the next one is the knowledge of practical knowledge. It was having practical intelligence. I forget.
What can you define what practical intelligence is?
Okay. So for example, maybe the ability to know how to make a house, maybe the ability to know how to make your own clothes, to grow food, practical intelligence, or I mean, it can apply to today's world. It doesn't have to be in a rustic situation. Knowing how to computer code, knowing how to make music, I think those are pretty practical things, but it seems...
So is it limited to skills that sort of have, what do you call it, value in the market, or that skills that sort of are helpful, beneficial to your own survival? Is that, or is there anything else that makes them unique?
Yeah, we're going to do a whole episode on what is practicality. How do you determine what is pragmatic, what is useful?
Right.
Kind of ties into the postmodernism episode we did, like how do you value
Right,
things?
well, because there's different ways you can measure usefulness and utility, right?
Right.
And only one of those involves money. And in fact, in some ways, that's the worst way to measure things. Unfortunately, that's how we end up measuring a lot of things, just because of, like, we're such a money-driven culture. And we don't tend to value other things nearly as much as we should, right?
Right, like family. What happened to that? That was a big thing back in the 50s. Anyways. Why can't I? Oh, I think it's called, give me a second, folks.
Yep.
I actually kind of want to, I remembered where it was. Just give me a second. I need to find this.
No problem.
I had so committed to memory that I wasn't so sure that I would need to. Okay, here it is. Sophros sune.
Okay.
Practical intelligence, phronesis.
Oh, I've heard phronesis before.
Okay. Courage, Andrea, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and justice, which is Takayo Sune. So you could do we could do an episode on each of these one topic. So self-control, practical intelligence, courage, and justice. These were the 4 main virtues that were strongly derived from Plato.
Yeah, I've read some Plato, and I'd love to go into those as well, because I remember there's a lot of dialogues about the various virtues. There's more than 4 that they talk about in those, but I'm kind of curious from that perspective. I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole here, but do you think...
I love rabbit holes.
Okay, I'll just give you, this is kind of a classic Platon or Plato and like type question. Platonic, yes, question for you. Good job with the conjugation that I couldn't do there.
It means something different in today's world, but yeah.
But yeah. So do you think of virtue as being like one thing? Like is all virtue like of a particular nature, or is virtue more of like there is like different aspects, or there are different subdivisions, or there are different pieces rather. Yeah, I think pieces is the right word to use here. There's different pieces of virtue that together as a whole make virtue.
So basically, is there sort of the penultimate virtue?
Right. Is it like every virtue kind of all ends up being encompassed by one like overarching thing? Or is it just like they're all like sort of not loosely connected, they're all like things that are like actually distinct and separate but related in some way?
So you might, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that you might more or less be asking, are some virtues more valuable than others?
Well, right. I mean, are they all equal is an important question there too. But I'm sort of more getting at like, what do they all have in common? What makes a thing a virtue versus not a virtue?
I see. What is the basic definition or classification that makes any one thing considered a virtue?
Right.
Like courage or practical intelligence or justice.
Right.
Well, if we let's look for the commonalities in the 4 that were listed.
Sure.
So self-control. So to me, that kind of speaks to being aware of your desires and not letting them control you, kind of having the executive control over them. Practical intelligence, which I think for someone like me who's inclined towards music, but probably isn't as useful in as many other disciplines as I could be, when I think of practical intelligence, I think of the ability to like fix a pipe or, paint a house or, fix a car perhaps. Like to me, those are like practical things that have utility outside of money. They're invaluable.
Right. But I mean, you could think of practical in other senses, like in terms of who has the knowledge that would like better your soul, for example.
Right. Like maybe a spiritual wisdom or, the knowledge of virtue.
Right. Which may not have monetary value, but might actually have like more practical value in some scenarios.
Well, I'm grateful you said that, because I mean, the highest, like you said, in the pyramid of needs, philosophy goes before the top. Philosophy certainly is a form of practical intelligence.
Yeah.
But it relies on, I think, reason.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at all of these things like courage and justice, they can all be explained with principles of reason and logic. You can make a logical case that self-control is prudent.
Mm-hmm.
You can make a case that practical intelligence is prudent. You can make arguments for each of these things, for courage being valuable and for justice to be valuable. Because for example, in a society without justice, bad people can get away with causing pain to others and not having to have any retribution for it.
Yeah, I think in some sense, though, you could, like I was trying to say earlier, you could think of practical knowledge, if you expand the notion of practical enough, could subsume kind of all of the others, right?
That is true. That is true. Good point. Well,
I think we're going to close this chapter out right there.
I think that's a great way to end it. So again, if for all of the Greek aficionados out there, sophrosune, self-control; phronesis, practical intelligence; courage, andrea; and justice, dikaiosune. We are Olympian Method. Thank you for joining us. Please leave any thoughts down below. What do you think is virtue?
Yeah.